welcome everybody to Conversations with the Monk Dude. This is where I get to speak to really interesting people about love, creativity, and wisdom. And today's guest is Dr. Rick Hanson. Let me tell you a bit about him. Rick Hanson, he's a psychologist, so obviously he's got a PhD. He's a senior fellow of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, which is close to where I live in Northern California. He's a New York Times best-selling author. His books include Hardwiring Happiness, Buddha's Brain, that's the one I read, and that's probably his most popular book, I think, Just One Thing, and Mother Nurture. I love that title. He edits the Wise Brain Bulletin and has several audio programs. A summa cum laude graduate of UCLA and founder of the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom. He's been an invited speaker at Oxford, Stanford, and Harvard, and taught in meditation centers worldwide. His work's been featured on BBC, CBS, and NPR, and he offers the free Just One Thing newsletter with over 100,000 subscribers, plus the online Foundations of Wellbeing program in positive neuroplasticity. So that's a lot to achieve in a still incomplete lifetime. I would just love to welcome you to the show. Thanks so much for coming on, Rick.
It's a pleasure to be here and an honor, honestly.
Thank you. Well, you're in good company. You know Dr. Jim Doty, I'm sure.
Yes,
Quite
well.
A few weeks ago.
Ah, that's great. A huge heart.
Yeah, he's a wonderful man. You're in the same field.
Yeah.
So, though he gets in there with a scalpel and all the kind of scary stuff, which I know you don't do.
Yeah. I'm a software guy.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Software in our heads.
Yeah.
So let's start off with hearing a bit about how you became so interested in and knowledgeable in the whole area of neuropsychology and contemplative wisdom.
It started for me like it starts for a lot of people, I think. One, I was suffering, and two, I've always had a very strong personal intuition, going back to, frankly, my earliest memories as a 3-year-old or even a 2-year-old, that there was a possibility for a peacefulness and a rested happiness and a lovingness while engaged with life that was really being missed. And when I was, 4 years old, that wasn't abstract or language, but it was a deep knowing that when I go back to my early childhood memories was really present, certainly by the time I was a boy and then a teenager. So that kind of set me on my journey. And I think that those perceptions of a possibility beyond the normal one for human well-being and even profundity and illumination is pretty widespread in a lot of people. So that set me on my journey, and then by the time I was meditating, I began when I was 21 in 1974, so people can do the math, I'm 63, and even then I was very interested in the ways in which both ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness were shaped by, conditioned by, resting in, arising on the basis of underlying physical, material, biological, neural processes, without denying the possibility of the transcendental and the supernatural. But clearly, there is a way in which mind is in life. A mind emerges from life. And if we really take words like embodiment seriously, we need to appreciate the ways, quite humbly, I think, that our exalted human consciousness is largely, an atheist would say entirely, minimally, largely, produced by underlying structures that have been evolving over 3.5 billion years, 600 million years of the evolution of the nervous system, and the solutions to the life and death survival necessities, passing on genes that pass on genes, of our great-grandparents upstream, right, are embedded in our brains today. We live with an enormous zoo and museum that's alive inside our own head, minimally, I think, in terms of the inner lizard, mouse, and monkey. So, long story short, as I got more and more interested in myself, particularly as I became more deeply involved in Buddhism over the last 20, 25 years, I become more and more interested in the intersection of Western psychology, which is full of insights and tools, neuroscience, as we understand more and more what's going on in the wetware, if you will, of our own nervous system, and then the great contemplative traditions, particularly Buddhism, which is the one I know best, without disrespecting any other contemplative tradition. What's at the intersection of those three circles, right? Psychology, neuroscience, and contemplative wisdom. And so I've been, plowing that intersection for 10, 20 years now, pretty seriously, searching for skillful means. I'm a methods guy. I produce a little bit of research. I mostly consume it. And I'm really interested in the trenches as an applied clinician, husband, father, human, mortgage holder, whatever. What's going to be actually helpful for people? So that's what I've been doing, and that's why I got interested in it.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that really impressed me last time we spoke. A couple of years ago I interviewed you without the luxury of video at that time.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated because you explained how you absorb, or what do you say, you consume a lot of research, but you have the advantage of being able to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
If I read all that stuff, my understanding is very partial, right? And you do a great job in your books, I have to say, of interpreting it for, the intelligent layperson, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's a great service because it gives millions of people a chance to understand this very exciting kind of cutting-edge area of research.
Yeah.
That intersection you just described of contemplative science and brain science. Can you tell us, well, I've got a lot of questions for you, but one of my first things is about the technology.
Say it again.
I have a question about the technology that's used to get some idea of what's actually going on inside a living brain. What is the latest technology that's used in that, and can you give us, a fairly easy to understand description of how that works?
Yeah, definitely. So, first, most of what we know about the human brain is based on research, often very invasive research, on the nervous systems of other animals. Because, for example, the neurological machinery for fear that is in the human brain, the basis for the emotion of fear and behavior related to fear. Not being reductionistic, just to be clear, there's the natural frame of science. Outside that natural frame are supernatural or transcendental factors, and I personally think they exist and are relevant and so forth. But that said, I'll stay right now inside the natural frame. So inside the natural frame, the machinery that's the physical basis of the emotion of fear and reactions related to fear in a human brain is very, very similar to that in a cat, or even in some basic levels inside a crocodile or an iguana. And so, setting aside the ethics, acknowledging the ethical issues around research on non-human animals, a lot of animals have been dissected, genetically modified, trained in mazes, mistreated in various ways, treated well in various ways to learn a lot about how the nervous system really works, drilled down to literally molecular processes at tiny little receptor sites, synapses, where neurotransmitter molecules dock and create this cascade of effects inside a single cell. So that's one way that this information has been acquired. And, the fact basis of it is very robust. I mean, it's the scientific basis of knowledge about the nervous system is very deep. So when these people say things, there's a lot of credibility behind it. And then in terms of human brains, the sophisticated scanners right now, have a resolution that's about a second or two long and maybe roughly a cubic millimeter. And on the one hand, that's phenomenal. But to give you a sense of scale, and these things kind of totally geek me out, part of what draws me to this material is that I just think it's like, oh my God, cool. So our brain has about 1.1 trillion cells, right? There are about 100 trillion cells in the body altogether. About 1% of them are in the brain. 1.1 trillion or so. 10% of those, about 100 billion, are neurons, okay, supported by roughly another trillion cells. We have as many neurons in our brain as stars in the Milky Way galaxy. And these neurons are squished together and connected with each other on average at about 5,000 points. giving us a network inside our head, our own internal World Wide Web, right, with about several hundred trillion little microprocessors. Each one of those connections is a little microprocessor. It's smart. It can do a lot of stuff at that one synapse, around which is all kinds of other stuff that's conveying information. So this whole network is really, really busy and consumes a lot of oxygen and glucose, in our blood to do its job. But it's really small. Those neurons have like a fat body with little wires sticking out on average. Those little fat bodies, on average, you could put 5 of them side by side in the width of one of your hairs. Okay? That's how small the cell body is of a neuron. But you could put 5,000 of those little microprocessors, the synapses, the junctions between neurons, the little connections, right? I think of the finger coming together at the top of the Sistine Chapel of God and Adam, that little tiny connection there, You could put 5,000 of them side by side in the width of a human hair. So if you imagine a resolution of a cubic millimeter, it's really, really small, but inside that cubic millimeter, you can pack millions of synapses. And also neurons are firing on average 5 to 50 times a second individually with brain waves, which just indicate synchronized patterns of firing of coalitions of millions, even billions of synapses all together. That's happening 5, 10, 80 times a second. So a lot of stuff's going on. And so if you have a resolution of a cubic millimeter, which sounds really small, and a temporal or time resolution of like a second, a lot of stuff can happen, that we're just missing. And so that said, at this point, the science is getting pretty exquisite in terms of being able to tell us really, really useful things that can steepen a person's learning curve on the cushion, as it were, or off the cushion, or their learning curve or ways of helping themselves deal with very, very ordinary things in daily life, like raising a teenager or arguing with your mate, or just trying to figure out how to help the world be a better place.
Okay, so how...
I hope that riff was okay. I get so caught up in it's like I'm enthusiastic about it.
Well, no, your enthusiasm is infectious. I'm very curious now. I was, when I asked the question, I was thinking of, okay, we see pictures from FMRI scans of people's brain, which, tell me if I'm incorrect, but as I understand it, they take a snapshot of a slice of the brain. I mean, they don't slice you open, but they take a picture of a snapshot of a slice of the brain, and they measure blood flow from temperature, and they identify to give some idea of where the most activity is. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they measure blood flow mainly from oxygen consumption, and they use oxygen consumption as a marker of metabolic activity, so they can identify which regions are more active. And then different kinds of scans can measure literally thickness in the cortex, the outer sheet of neurons that's kind of wraps around everything, that contains most of that.
And that's one of the thickness of the, did you say the cortex?
Yeah.
So the cortex is one of the areas where meditation's been shown to have some effect, right?
That's right. It can thicken it. So you'll notice things that long-term meditators have literally thicker cortex in key regions from which you can draw inferences about the effects of meditation or the effects of different kinds of meditation. Also, they're able to literally measure connectivity because you can cross-correlate metabolic activity. So you could start noticing what happens when people become more integrated, let's say, in terms of different parts of their brain, or less connected, less integrated. And they can also measure brainwave activity and notice changes, for example, in people who are long-term meditators compared to people who are not. Right. So the technology is getting really, really advanced.
So what fairly clear conclusions, I mean, you've talked about inference, but what clear conclusions have come out of that body of research? What's the latest news about what kind of changes can come from meditation practice?
It's really impressive. The quick summary is cortex. When cortex is thicker, it means there are more synapses there, and also there are more capillaries bringing in blood. So that thickens the sheet. And remembering that you can pack millions of new synapses into a cubic millimeter. So the cortex is about 4 to 6 millimeters thick. So a fraction of a millimeter of difference for, let's say, a meditator compared to a non-meditator makes a difference. It's a little bit like growing a muscle. If you make your bicep measurably bigger, that means you can lift more weight, with that particular motion. So long-term meditators have measurably thicker cortex in a part of the brain called the insula, which is what we use to tune into ourselves, both like our inner body sensations as well as our deep feelings. And we use the insula to tune into other people. So people who do contemplative practice tend to be better at tuning into the emotions of other people. That's a reliable finding. A second finding...
Empathy, in a word.
Yeah, empathy. That's exactly right. That aspect of empathy, emotional empathy. Okay. Second, long-term meditators tend to have more cortex, thicker cortex rather, right behind the forehead. So they tend to be more able to do what that part of the brain does, which is top-down executive regulation of attention and impulses and emotions. And that again makes sense. The classic statement is neurons that fire together wire together. In other words, if you stimulate a part of the brain repeatedly, you're going to change neural structure or function there over time. And as you do that, that part of the brain becomes more powerful, for better or worse. Right? If we repeatedly obsess about something anxious with anxiety, we're going to build up receptors and we're going to change neural structure and function that will sensitize us to feeling threatened. We'll actually get more anxious over time in a vicious cycle. So going back to meditators, that's the second reliable finding, more or thicker cortical tissue in the prefrontal cortex. A third reliable finding is less activity in the amygdala, the alarm bell of the brain, so people get less emotionally reactive. That makes sense. Also, there's more white tissue, so the support cells get more robust, and there's more connectivity in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which helps us put things in perspective. Also, the hippocampus calms down the alarm bell, which is great, making us more resilient and even-keeled, more equanimous. So in the classic saying, we can walk evenly over uneven ground. And that's a pretty reliable finding. Another reliable finding is there tends to be greater activation of the left prefrontal cortex compared to the right prefrontal cortex. This is reversed for roughly half of all left-handed people, but the point is still the same. And that matters because as you increase activation of the left prefrontal cortex compared to the right, your mood tends to go up because, in part, the left prefrontal cortex helps calm down negative emotion. We still feel irritated by things, but we recover more quickly, and we don't have such intense spikes of negative emotion. Two more reliable findings. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. I love this stuff. It's so great, and it's a motivator to practice. Let's see. Next to last reliable finding is that long-term meditators, particularly people who do a lot of practice, have more what's called gamma wave activity in their brains. Gamma waves are just fast. They're like 30 to 80 beats per second, which means you have huge swaths of neural real estate that are more integrated with each other, because you got to be more integrated to have that kind of gamma wave activity, which probably corresponds to a more of a sense of wholeness and unification of consciousness and even singleness of mind. And then the last really cool finding, they did a 3-month meditation retreat with pretty serious meditators who are prepared to go off on retreat for 3 months. And when they compared the people who had gone on the retreat with the people who had not gone on retreat, who are also serious meditators, the people who had gone on retreat had measurably longer telomeres, which are the atoms that are the caps on the ends of DNA, molecules inside the body. And this matters because as we get older, and every time cells divide, the DNA molecules in it split in half and then form a new molecule of DNA. As that occurs, errors creep in, and those telomeres shrink in their length, which is associated with, and probably in part the cause of, age-related diseases.
Wow.
Diseases related to getting older. So in effect, meditating helps you stay younger in your body. Now maybe that's only in effect for hardcore 3-month, practice, but it's very suggestive of other things. And one of the co-authors on that study, just to show you how solid the science is, was Elizabeth Blackburn, who just won a Nobel Prize for her work on telomeres, these little caps on the ends of the molecule of DNA.
So you've got pretty high-level scientists involved in the meditation-related research.
Really, absolutely. Partly because for a while it was career suicide, so nobody would publish unless they really had the goods. They had a lot of aces in their hand. So the science, particularly currently, tends to be quite robust. Now, caveat, most parts of the brain do lots of things, so we have to be a little cautious about interpreting the meaning of some increased activity in one part of the brain compared to a different part of the brain. And there is kind of a tendency to get a finding in the MRIs and then tell the story that you want to tell, for your study. But that said, I think the bottom line takeaway for people is to appreciate your practice makes a difference in your brain. And obviously it's already making a practice in your mind and your heart. Why do we need to know about the brain to motivate us to practice? The Buddha and other great teachers didn't know anything about the brain. But the bottom line point is that for a lot of people, knowing that contemplative practice, which isn't always your first preference, for how to spend the next 10 minutes or 45 minutes or longer, that actually your practice is changing your brain for the better. And as as your brain changes for the better, so does your mind, and so does your life.
And it's a good way to convince your skeptical mother-in-law, or
That's correct. Exactly right. And then I think a little bit, you can work. I mean, for those who have an interest in deep contemplative practice, as I know you do, and who really have an interest in going far on the path of awakening, there's a lot about neuroscience that really deepens insight. Because when you start to appreciate that, our experience is being conditioned and constructed very impersonally by this underlying gushy, gooey process embedded in a gushy, gooey body that's deeply shaped by evolution and also arises very interdependently here and now in life. Mind is embedded in life. You start realizing that there's no owner of your own mind. It is linked to a particular body, okay, but in terms of claiming some kind of self, inside there, inside the natural frame, it really helps you, deconstruct your upset with your wife or some politician on the television, or something not going your way, and really does guide, for me, a much more peaceful and disidentified, light, non-craving relationship to living and experiencing. And that's good for practice. And for me, increasingly, it makes us accessible to the transcendental. When you become more and more unidentified with the mind process, you start getting more and more of a sense of its foaminess, its insubstantialness, its porousness, and which can take you to more and more of a sense of the unconditioned that's always just prior to this moment of solidified actuality. That's pretty deep stuff.
Well, we're meditators. We want to know about this stuff, and
yeah.
A lot of the people listening in are also exploring this. So, now you've mentioned a number of different areas that have, measurable changes, benefits. I'm a musician and a writer, and creative writer, and that. So, I'm particularly interested in the phenomenon of creativity and imagination.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you've come across in the research that indicates that meditation enhances those faculties?
I don't know all the studies on meditation, but I'm pretty familiar with the basic. Most of them, let's say, are where it's going, you know, and I cannot think of any particular finding on creativity per se, but I think very plausibly, meditation would tend to foster attitudes and would develop inner resources that in other studies have been associated with creativity. Like, for example, openness. I think meditation can help us become more open. You know, in language I use and others use, that becomes a mental resource. I call it an inner strength. Openness. So we can become more tolerant of strange ideas or unnerving imagery arising from the swampy id-like depths, you know, that Freud charted to some extent. So openness is a factor. Also, stability of attention. To be able to be creative, to take this inkling or intimation of something or passing image and then actually stay with it or ride that river, right? And then also start manifesting it in form in some way, musically or artistically or linguistically with language or in the body. You got to have some steadiness of attention. And we live in a fundamental ADD training. Our culture is like if you want to train a generation of people to have ADD, do what we're doing. Right?
Give them all smartphones, yeah.
Yeah, when they're like 8 years old.
Yeah.
And so training attention supports creativity. And I think there are a variety of other factors as well. So I bet, you know, some smart grad student could do a thesis on, you know, meditation and creativity, and I bet they'd have good findings.
So you mentioned something about different methods or techniques of meditation having different, somewhat different effects.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know if you know of any research into meditation using mantra.
Right. Most of the early research on meditation was done with TM.
Right.
And I never did the formal TM training, but my understanding is that it uses mantra. Right. And just so you know my own background, I've done quite a lot of I've done quite a lot of I would say more Hindu-based practices over the years. I'd say my home base is Buddhism, but I've done those kinds of things, including with mantra, and both in my mind or, you know, kirtan, kind of out loud. And you know, the findings on TM are really quite robust. They're really quite powerful. It's been a bit of an historical accident that most of the recent research on meditation has been driven by people who come out of the Buddhist tradition, typically either Tibetan or Theravadan, you know, the more quote-unquote Vipassana stream of things. But, you know, I'm sure that if what there has been is a fair amount of research that makes the distinction between what's called focused attention practices, like a concentration on a mantra practice would be focused attention. You could use another target of attention like your breath or loving kindness or something else, but it's about absorption in the object of attention. And then there's what's called open awareness meditation, which has more of a Buddhist feeling to it. It's where you're kind of sustaining choiceless awareness, and there's an increasingly radical presencing of experiencing without any influence whatsoever. Okay? So in that context then, there has been a fair amount of contrast research done on focused attention versus open awareness. And, you know, I would say in general, focused attention practices tend to engage more prefrontal regions that are involved with top-down regulation, just like you would kind of assume. And while open awareness practices tend to take us out more to the lateral regions of our brain that are more involved with kind of gestalt awareness of the whole, and with a sense of really being in the emerging edge of now, while radically and continually letting go. And that tends to involve parts of the attentional systems that are using just alerting. Something is happening, I don't know what it is, I don't know where it is, I don't know why it is, I don't know if it's friend or foe, but something is happening. That's the alerting aspect of attention. Followed about a third of a second later by the orienting aspect of attention that starts to go, where is it, what is it, and what do I need to do about it, okay? And so if you're training yourself to just be now, right, without understanding, without knowing, without categorizing, without labeling, just now, you tend to increase your ability to register each moment freshly. And so that's the distinction, let's say, between an open awareness training that would have more of a Zen flavor to it, what I just said, compared to an absorption practice, which would be more about going deep into the stimulus, which in this case, as you mentioned, would be a mantra.
So you mentioned kirtan. Do you know of any research into the effects of kirtan, which for the listeners, chanting, usually chanting mantras, usually with music?
I don't know of any, and I think there should be a lot more, because if you think about it, while I think meditation is powerful and special and so forth, a lot of its effects overlap other things. Like a lot of the benefit of meditation, frankly, is stress relief. So to find what's the difference between meditating and just really, really relaxing, yeah? Or what's the difference between, let's say, kirtan, which involves so much of devotion in the heart, and some other form of loving practice, like petting your cat. Like if you scan the brains, or your dog, like hugging your dog or your granddaughter for 20 minutes straight, compared to chanting some beautiful ecstatic prayer to the divine for 20 minutes straight, the skeptic in me is not sure that you'd find much difference. I suspect there'd be a lot of overlap in the results on the brain. So I just want to kind of acknowledge that. And I think this is the sort of stuff that's going to be teased apart over the next 100 years, 1,000 years. But at the end of the day, I want to make, for me, what is a really important point. The bottom line at the end of the day is, what's it like to be you? Are you kinder? Are you wiser? Are you happier? Are you less reactive? Do you have more of a sense of oneness with the divine? Are you more given over to wholesome purposes or not, right? And if you are, that's good, number one. And number two, inside the natural frame, all evidence of mental change, including your own subjective experience or what other people say about you, let alone some finding, in a research study, evidence of mental change inside the natural frame is evidence of neural change. We may not yet have the technology to really, really pin down that difference, but if your mind is changing, your brain must be changing as well, right? And to me, that's the real key takeaway here. I'm very aware of a lot of the research in this field, and I think, honestly, the granularity that's been of effectiveness that's available to us in the great contemplative traditions, as well as in psychology, without reference to what's known about the brain. In other words, the granularity that's useful, that's available to us in contemplative traditions without reference to the brain, is much greater than the granularity of beneficial effectiveness of skillful means that it's available to us by knowing about the brain.
Well, yeah, for me, it's a kind of, it's to convince people who might otherwise not consider practicing it, or to convince, or to motivate people, because this is real. I mean, we live in a kind of a culture where even if people attest to some sort of spiritual belief, we really are encouraged to see the physical world as reality, and everything else is somehow not real. Yeah. And so this kind of helps people to believe that it's going to help them.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, so for me, a way I would say it is that if you know something about the brain, I think there are 4 benefits in bringing the brain into contemplative practice. So maybe I'll just name them quickly if that's okay. The first is that it's motivating. That's what we've talked about so far. Okay, that's good. Motivation is good. 2, it gives us a framework in which we can understand different traditions that are using different ways of speaking about the same underlying universal human biological processes. And also, this kind of overarching, we all have a human brain, right? This kind of overarching framework can help us contrast different traditions. We can start to understand and highlight the differences between different traditions and what they're trying to accomplish, and their strengths and their weaknesses for different people at different times in different situations. Okay. Third benefit that I think is one of the most important benefits of all is that brain science highlights what makes the most difference. And often you'll see people using brain science to conclude that a certain approach is really, really useful, or that two different approaches are basically equal, and so claims on from either tradition that their method is better don't hold water. But when you're done with that, especially in terms of brain science highlighting a really important thing, you find that some great teacher has already said that, or some tradition is already deep in that. But of the 10,000 spiritual tools, ballpark, in the warehouse, how do you know the ones that really matter, right? And I think one of the takeaways, for example, that brain science is teaching us is that it's really, really important to practice cultivation of the wholesome through dwelling in wholesome thoughts, feelings, desires, and body sensations and perceptions. Not to deny the bad or minimize it or suppress it, but to help our brains internalize those wholesome factors of awakening, as well as ordinary well-being and effectiveness, and also psychological healing, because we have a brain that learns very rapidly from unwholesome, unpleasant, painful, negative states of mind, and learns very slowly from wholesome states of mind. That's useful. Now, knowing that, you can go, oh yeah, there's certain traditions, like bhakti-oriented traditions, or the loving kindness emphasis traditions in Buddhism, or other forms of ecstatic dwelling in wholesome states of mind that have already existed. So it's not like brain science is inventing something that's new, but it's really highlighting what we need to emphasize.
Yeah.
I think that's a key point. And then last, the fourth benefit, occasionally brain science suggests something really, really new, like neurofeedback devices. I think that's new technology that is just beginning to be used. It's young technology, so I think there's a middle way between dogmatic rejection on one side and honestly sentimental idealizing, over adopting on the other. There's a place in the middle there. But yeah, neurofeedback, I think, is really going to be helpful for people, especially beginning and intermediate practitioners, along the way. I think for many people, honestly, psychotropic medication can really aid meditation. If you're just so depressed, you can't dwell in a emotionally positive, blissful state of mind. Taking Zoloft might really help your practice. Or maybe you're so distractible, in part because you grew up in an ADD culture. Maybe for you, Ritalin helps you sustain attention. Okay, I'm very pragmatic at the end of the day about this kind of thing. Yeah, okay, good. So those are the four benefits that I've seen in bringing brain science into contemplative practice.
Oh, that was pretty insightful. Thank you. Wow. Yeah, I kind of like what you said about your reference to biofeedback or neurofeedback, because as a yogi, been practicing for 40 years, I tend to think it's cheating, but then I sort of catch myself and I think, well, if it works and it helps somebody, why not? But as you say, it's an infant technology, and I tend to think you're probably right. It might be good for people who are starting out or intermediate practitioners. I think in the long run this goes beyond the physical. So we need you just got to work with the most what is really the most sophisticated piece of technology in the universe, which is your own brain.
Yeah, that's right. I'm good with all that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's neat. But I thought that was a really nice, insightful way of describing it. Now, you haven't actually mentioned the word, I don't think, of neuroplasticity. I love this word. It feels like you want to squish it and it'll stay in place, which is exactly what it is, right?
It really...
Well, sort of.
Yeah. Like right now, I can remember the bulk of this conversation, right? You could, including in a fair amount of detail, like if we rewound the recording, let's say, and you said, hey, Rick, when we were talking about such and such, I could probably recreate pretty well what happened, and you could too, and also viewers or listeners could as well. Well, how do we do that? Obviously, something has to change inside for us to be able to do that. How do we do that, right? So the rate of change in this underlying hardware is just extraordinary. And so there's short-term change. That's a form of plasticity, in other words, change. And then there's long-term neuroplasticity. And that goes to the saying, neurons that fire together wire together, which is one of the grosser forms of neuroplasticity. Literally new connections being built, in the little tendrils in the nervous system reaching out for each other. But also existing synapses that are being worked repeatedly, like dwelling your mind, resting your mind, dwelling in the wholesome, say, like loving kindness or compassion, or just simply a certain peaceful recognition that your influence over events is really limited, and you can rest in the bliss of blamelessness, as the Buddha put it, knowing that you've done everything you can, and yet most of the causes that determine the outcome are outside of your hands. And you can dwell in that as well to help it really, really get encoded in some kind of lasting change in neural structure or function. So you can have existing synapses that are being used. They get more sensitive. Busy regions get more blood. There are even changes in gene expression. This is crazy. People who routinely meditate, say, or do forms of other, let's say, relaxation training. Meditation is relaxing. It overlaps other forms of relaxation training. People who repeatedly do things that help them relax have improved expression of genes inside the DNA, this long, huge molecule twisted up that I'm told is actually 6 feet long if you were to unwrap twisted up DNA. It's, oh my goodness, right? They actually have improved expression of little strips of atoms, genes in other words, inside that molecule, expression of genes that calm down stress reactions. In other words, people who routinely practice relaxation become more resilient when stressors land on them. Like, wow. So there are many, many forms. I read a review paper, I think a year and a half ago or so, that at that point identified several dozen distinct mechanisms of neuroplastic change based on the experiences flowing through us. That's what neuroplasticity means.
Right. And so what it means in terms of what we ought to do with our minds, I mean, it reinforces what you've been saying. There's this old saying in yoga that as you think, so you become.
Yes,
of course,
that's right.
Not supposed to be taken literally, but you think in a particular vein, and that'll reinforce itself, and it'll stay if you do it often.
Yeah, a couple things for me, like takeaways, from this whole territory at the level of personal practice. One of them is to get on your own side. Because if you're not for yourself, not against others, but for yourself, a friend to yourself, if you're not bringing the same sense of justice and benevolence, kindness, to yourself that you would bring to others, you're not going to engage your mind in ways that will be positive and productive for yourself in terms of healing or well-being or effectiveness, let alone self-actualization or awakening. So that's been a big takeaway for me, to realize that we have this extraordinary organ, as you say, the most magnificent physical system known to humankind, certainly the most complex physical system that science knows, the human brain. It was handed to us. The instructions for building it were given to us on the moment of our conception. That little sperm cell and ovum coming together. I don't want to get too visual about that with my own parents. But anyway, that was given to us. Who could earn that, right? Jaw-dropping gratitude and also responsibility. What will you do with that amazing gift, right? That's for me been a big takeaway. And a second big takeaway has been this recognition that in any moment we are firing certain neurons and then therefore wiring them together. We are engaging one network or another. The Native American teaching story says there are two wolves in our heart, one of love and one of hate, and that everything depends on which one we feed each day.
Right.
I would say each minute. Where's your attention resting? And what are you doing with what it's resting upon? If something negative and problematic is arising, are you holding it in spacious awareness, which will associate that negative material with spacious, untroubled awareness or other perspectives about it? Or are you glued to the tube and identified with the negative, reinforcing it in your own brain, with a brain that is like Velcro for the bad, but Teflon for the good, right? The brain is designed to be rapidly affected by the negative. Or, on the other hand, when wholesome possibilities arise, like all little things, like I'm looking at the color of your turban. It's so beautiful. What a rad. Oh my goodness. Light, right? Or in this moment, I just see the warmth and love in your eyes. What a nice opportunity to feel connected with another being or to respect another person. I have a lot of respect for you, by the way. That's why I'm doing this interview.
I know you normally wouldn't do that.
No.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, for real. And so, or in the moment I'm feeling kind of articulate. All right, I can, not in some egoic way. Actually, as we internalize these wholesome experiences, including of self-worth, we become less narcissistic and conceited and grasping and striving for those experiences. That's the second big takeaway from me. In addition to the first one, getting on your own side, to disengage rapidly from and stop fueling negative, unwholesome, problematic states of mind. That doesn't mean fighting them or denying them or resisting them, which just feeds them, right? But not fueling them. And in particular, looking for opportunities to give over to the good, to rest our mind, our heart, our body in what is beautiful and wholesome and true and useful. That's the second big takeaway for me from what I've learned in my deep dive over 15 years into what I call neurodharma.
That's a nice term. I love that, neurodharma.
Yeah.
You've really gotten good at interpreting this, pretty esoteric. I mean the science esoteric.
Yeah.
Interpreting that for Dharma esoteric people.
Yeah.
It's really neat. And some of your talks, I've been stalking you, of course, because I wanted to review some of what you've been talking about and teaching. And one of the pieces I liked was about the neuropsychology of learning, and you talk about 2 stages of that.
Oh, yeah.
Can you describe that for
Oh, I'd love to. It's so practical. And this is where neuroscience really helps, okay? Because if you think about it, we're having lots and lots of experiences. The question is, what are we gaining from them? What are we gaining that has any kind of lasting value? And particularly with a brain that's designed to become increasingly anxious, irritated, depressed, pessimistic, and blue from negative experiences. There's a quality effect for unpleasant, quote-unquote, negative experiences. Even if most of our experiences are neutral or mildly positive, there's a quantity effect. For positive experiences, there's a quality effect, an impact effect for negative ones. So if you're interested in developing, right, if you want to heal from your trauma or your rocky childhood or, how you were mistreated in your last relationship, or you want to develop inner strength, psychological resources for daily living, or spiritual resources, for your own path, how do you actually do that? How does the brain change for the better? And it's a 2-stage process, as you point out. The first stage is activation. You have to have some kind of thing in your mind in the first place, right? We don't have brains like an iPod or like Neo in the Matrix, where you just jack in a cable and suddenly you have a new song on your playlist, or you can suddenly do kung fu or fly a helicopter. No, you record the song in the brain like an old school cassette recorder or a DVR. You record it by playing it. You have to have that experience in the first place, that beneficial thought or perception, especially body sensations, or beneficial emotion or desire or embodied action. It needs to be happening in the first place. So opening to the wholesome experiences you're already having, and especially looking for legitimate opportunities to have one. Like I just started looking at your turban and went, Wow, that's so beautiful. You know, this whole approach really makes you younger. Like you look at the world more and more through the eyes of a child, like, wow, there's so many wow opportunities around us. Not overlooking the negative, but using these methods to grow strengths inside, to deal with what's problematic, with what's negative. The more your life sucks, the more you need to bring your awareness to what's actually beautiful, positive, wholesome, useful, in yourself or in other people. Okay, so now you get the song playing. That's the first stage. You have to activate a state. You know, you get something going in short-term memory buffers. But the critically important second step is you have to install that experience as a lasting trait. Otherwise, there's no lasting value. It was a momentarily pleasant experience. It was better than a stick in the eye, but it made no difference. There was no learning, using that term broadly. Yeah, there was no growth. There was no healing. There was no change for the better. And so, you know, having a useful experience is the necessary first step, but it's not sufficient. Necessary and sufficient is activation plus installation. And then what is installation? So very briefly, it just means keep those neurons firing for a little while so they have time to wire that beneficial experience. What I mean by that is like a moment of accomplishment. I got something done today. Or realizing with a little bit of chagrin, you know, it's more skillful to do this instead of that when I'm struggling with someone or when I'm feeling sad inside. Or maybe there's an opportunity to feel a little more grateful, a little more loving, or a little more courageous, or a little more awake in your own spirituality. Like for me, I'm increasingly seeking to stabilize this, what I think of as Buddha mind, you know, more and more a mind without any bit of craving in it, you know, while engaging life, but without any form of resisting the unpleasant, chasing the pleasant, or clinging to what's heartfelt, or wanting the neutral to hurry up and get happy, right? So I'm trying to stabilize that in subtle ways. You can apply these methods to very subtle, you know, states of consciousness, including quite exalted ones. So the trick here is what heightens installation, what heightens the impact of our beneficial experiences is duration. The longer you're staying with it, the better. 5, 10, 20, 30 seconds in a row. Intensity. The more intensely we experience gratitude or love or grit or determination or commitment to our own sobriety, the more intensely we experience it, the more those neurons are going to fire. Third, multimodality. The more it's a whole body experience, not just conceptual. There's a place for developing conviction about wise view of various kinds, including the wise view that I'm not responsible for my partner's alcoholism. Okay? Or it doesn't work to come home and grumble at everybody before I establish a loving connection. Then we can talk about the house is a mess or whatever, right? But, you know, sure, those thoughts are useful, but where most of the action is in the body, is emotion and sensation and desire. So, multimodality. Fourth factor, and you don't need to do them all, but the more the better. Fourth factor is novelty. The more we can look at things using that alerting aspect of attention I spoke about earlier, where each moment is like the fresh gift of the universe to us, the more that we will be affected by and internalize our beneficial experiences. And then last, or next to last rather, salience, personal relevance. Why would it be useful for me, as a kid who grew up really shy, dorky kid, me, didn't feel very seen or cared about or wanted by others? Why would it be helpful to me today to feel cared about by my wife or my children or by the people in my meditation gathering, let's say? You know, the more you can see the personal relevance of your beneficial experiences, the more it's like those are keepers. I'm going to write a little essay soon called Keep the Keepers. You know, we have these experiences that are keepers. Well, slow it down. Show up for your own life in an embodied way to keep the keepers. And then last, intend and sense that the experience is sinking into you. So you will tend to sensitize and prime and make more efficient the structure building processes in your own brain. All right? You don't need to do them all. You know, where it really shows up mainly is, I summarize all that in 4 words. Have it, enjoy it. Have it, activate a beneficial state, usually because it's already there, or you deliberately create it because you look for it. Like I created an aesthetic experience looking at the color of your turban or scanning your eyes, right? Either way, have it, and then enjoy it. Let yourself receive it. Even though, like, American culture is superficially such a pleasure-seeking consumerist culture, I think of American culture and Western culture kind of broadly as like the hell realm they speak of in Tibet, the land of the hungry ghosts, you know, with beings with godlike powers, you know, nuclear weapons, super technology, media empires, you know, wealth, like godlike beings with enormous appetites, represented as big bellies. But the ways in which people satisfy their appetites is represented as pinhole mouths. You know, they can't get it in. And I think that that drives so much of the craving that is, you know, sending the planet to the edge of the cliff. And paradoxically, if we actually experience that our needs are being satisfied, we have three core needs: safety, satisfaction, connection. You know, avoid the harmful, approach the, you know, pleasant, the pleasurable, and you know, attached to the other person, right?
Coming out of the different types of brain, right?
Yeah, and that loosely links to the lizard, the mouse, and the monkey, brainstem, subcortex, cortex inside us all, right? Safety, satisfaction, connection, loosely. So when people experience, I am safe in this moment, I'm basically all right now, I'm protected, I have resources, I have people who would stick up for me, I don't need to feel so threatened, and then I don't need to be so threatening to other people. Also, as I experience in this moment, contentment, the enoughness of the moment. Oh my God, so many beautiful things, even in a life of difficulty. You know, some of the happiest people in the world are the poorest ones, right? Then there's no basis for craving in that regard, right? And then also in this moment, if I can feel I am loved, I am connected, I am liked, I am worthy, I am you know, deserving of love, I am a lovable being. As we can register that experience, again, that aspect of craving falls away. And then we rest more and more. We're not yet enlightened, but we rest more and more in a mind that is undisturbed and undefended and unthreatening toward others. And if we could get a critical mass of human brains who feel, you know, undisturbed inside, undefended, and unthreatening, my number is roughly 1 billion, most minutes of most days, you know, in the green zone I call it, you know, we will change the course of human history.
Different world, yeah. Brilliant.
Yeah.
That's what we dream of.
Yeah, well, the personal is the political. And when we do personal practice so that we can rest in a place where we do recognize threat, but we deal with it on the basis of an underlying sense of peace, and we recognize losses, and we also dream big dreams, we swing for the fences, you know, we write our books, we create our songs, we build our businesses, we offer our teachings to more and more people, let's say, but we do that on the basis of an underlying unconditional sense of contentment. And if we deal with other people, including interpersonal context, but on the basis of an underlying sense of love, that changes everything.
That's a lovely point to kind of wind up on. I have a dozen more questions for you another time.
Another time.
If you grant me my wish.
Another time, brother.
One day, when you've had your break. Now, I know you're going on a sabbatical soon, and I saw you're going to New Zealand.
I am. Oh, yeah, I love New Zealand, honestly. If I were a younger man, I'd think seriously about emigrating.
What are you going to do there?
I'm going to teach a training in these methods of positive neuroplasticity, the last thing we talked about earlier. We talked about it here in general, mindful cultivation. Okay. How do we actually cultivate the wholesome, skillfully, given the way the nervous system actually works, in very practical ways. So I'm going to do that in New Zealand and also in Australia. 2 3-day workshops that people can string together if they want. The first 3-day workshop is the basic methods, and then the second 3 days about applying this stuff in professional settings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to do that, but then I'm going to take a week-long vacation in the northern part of the southern island.
The northern
around Nelson. Yeah.
Oh, Nelson, I know Nelson. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Longest sunshine hours in the country.
Yeah.
Orange, it's the place to live.
All right, there you are.
Orange is like sunshine. They grow a lot of oranges there.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so happy you're going to lovely New Zealand. You said them New Zealand is right. They need you.
I think New Zealand is amazing. And if I could just mention something that people might want to check out, on my website, Rick Hanson, son.net, are tons of freely offered resources. Things I've written, videos, talks, slide sets from 1 million workshops I've given in a range of settings, from NASA engineers at one end of the spectrum to really intense spiritually oriented workshops to take you out into allness. So that's the whole range. And they can also, if they want, find out about my free newsletter as well as many, many other things on that website.
So, folks, if you want to find out more about what Rick has to offer, that's Rick Hanson, son.net. You can go to his website and get all that material.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I wish you the best, and namaste.
Namaskar to you, and have a wonderful time. I know you're not going to get away till the new year, but when you get to the southern hemisphere, give it my love.
Okay. I will.
Thanks so much.
I can feel it coming through you to me to that, the land of green. Beautiful. Yeah. All right, you take care. Namaste again. Bye-bye.